"Gabriel, you're going to pay for the $45,000 for my wedding, or you'll lose your mother forever." My mother's voice cut through the air of the French restaurant like a sharp blade. She was sitting across from me, wearing a red dress that cost more than my monthly salary, with her new husband Richard beside her, flashing a predatory smile that reminded me of a vulture spotting carrion. I stopped with my fork halfway to my mouth, watching them both with the same calm I used to analyze problematic contracts at my law firm. "Excuse me," I said, slowly lowering my fork to my plate. "Did you say $45,000? "It's the minimum for a decent wedding," Richard interjected, adjusting his Italian tie, which probably cost more than most people's rent. "Her mother deserves the best after everything she's been through." "My name is Gabriel, I'm 32 years old, and I just found out that my widowed mother believes my money is part of her dowry." The irony was not lost on me. She had invited me to a special dinner at Le Bernardin, the most expensive restaurant in town, to announce that I would be paying for her wedding party, with the money I worked so hard to earn as a corporate lawyer. Richard went on about flowers imported from Holland and a photographer who worked with celebrities, but I was studying my mother. Beautiful 58, a widow for only 18 months since my father died of cancer. For years, I had sent her $2,000 a month to help with her expenses. Money I thought was being used for therapy, medication, and emotional reconstruction after losing the love of her life. Apparently, I was funding her hunt for a new husband. "Gabriel," my mother said, her voice taking on that manipulative tone I had known since childhood, when she wanted an expensive toy or permission to do something dangerous. "Your father left me enough money, but I want to save it for our future security. You're my son. It's your responsibility to take care of your mother's happiness." "My responsibility," I repeated, tasting the words like the expensive wine Richard had insisted on ordering without consulting me. "Exactly. And Richard has some wonderful ideas for investments that could benefit us as a family." Ah. So it wasn't just about the marriage. It was about full access to my resources. Richard leaned forward, clearly comfortable taking control of what should have been a mother-son conversation. "Gabriel, I've been a real estate broker for 15 years. I have connections that can triple any investment in 6 months. Think of it as a family loan with a generous return guarantee." I nodded thoughtfully, noticing how he avoided direct eye contact when he talked about guarantees, and how his hands moved nervously when he mentioned specific numbers. "And if I say no?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother exchanged a quick glance with Richard, one of those looks couples develop when they conspire together. Then she straightened her shoulders and assumed the posture I knew so well from childhood. It was the same expression she wore when she wanted something and was willing to destroy anything to get it. "So you're not the son I thought I raised," she said, her voice as cold as polar ice. "And maybe it's time to reconsider what kind of relationship we want to have going forward. Especially considering that Richard and I are planning to start a new family." The threat hung over the table like toxic smoke. New family. As if I were a disposable piece in an old game. But as they waited for my emotional reaction, tears, pleas, immediate capitulation, I remembered something crucial that had happened last week. My secretary had mentioned a strange phone call. Someone posing as a researcher asking about my schedule, my financial situation, whether I had any close family, how much I earned, where I invested. At the time, I thought it was spam or a scam attempt. Now, looking at Richard adjusting his expensive tie again and my mother avoiding my direct gaze, I realized that there was nothing casual about this dinner. They had planned it carefully. Researched my situation. Even timed the location. What they didn't know was that I had also planned a few things. If you're enjoying this story of family manipulation and want to find out how a simple emotional blackmail turned into the biggest life lesson my mother ever received, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because when Richard finished talking about the mutual benefits of this family arrangement, I just smiled and said, "Sure, Mom. I'll pay the $45,000. The relief that crossed their faces was almost comical. But they didn't know that this would be the most expensive decision they ever made. Richard Spencer wasn't the type of man my mother used to date. At 46, he had that polished look of someone who sold expensive houses to rich people, but something in his eyes reminded me of sharks I'd seen in documentaries. Always calculating, always looking for the next prey. "Gabriel," he said, leaning forward with that salesman's smile that probably worked on vulnerable widows, "I want you to know that your concerns are completely understandable. A protective son looking out for his mother. It's admirable. My mother held his hand over the table, displaying the engagement ring that definitely didn't cost less than $20,000. Funny how she always said she couldn't spend my father's life insurance money, but apparently Richard deserved diamonds. But you have to understand, he continued, that Linda deserves to be happy again. She spent 18 months in mourning, denying herself even small pleasures because she felt guilty for going on. Guilty. The word ricocheted around my mind like a stray bullet. My mother had never shown guilt when she started dating Richard just 8 months after my father's funeral. She never seemed guilty when she sold Dad's vintage watch, the one he had inherited from his father, to buy a new walk-in closet. And she certainly didn't show guilt now, demanding that I finance her honeymoon in the Maldives. Richard is right, my mother said, her voice taking on that melodramatic tone I remembered from the school plays where she always played the victim. I've deprived myself of happiness for too long. Your father wouldn't want me to suffer forever. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost impressive. Using my father's memory to justify extorting money from his son. What about the investments? I asked, cutting another piece of the duck that had cost $120 on the menu. Richard mentioned opportunities. His eyes lit up like headlights. Oh yes. I have a client in Miami who is developing a beachfront hotel complex. Minimum investment is $100,000, but the projected return is 300% in 2 years. 300%. In 2 years. Anyone with a basic knowledge of finance would recognize this as a Ponzi scheme, but Richard spoke with the confidence of someone who had convinced desperate widows before. Interesting, I murmured, watching him avoid mentioning specific details such as the name of the company, building permits, or feasibility studies. And have you invested your own money in this project? An almost imperceptible pause. Naturally. I'm one of the first investors. Bullshit. I had done my research on Richard Spencer the week before, after my secretary mentioned that strange phone call. I discovered that he had filed for bankruptcy twice in the last 10 years, always after real estate investment schemes had collapsed. His broker's license had been suspended in Nevada for questionable practices. But most interestingly, he had a pattern. Always widows with substantial life insurance, always promises of miraculous investments, always quick marriages followed by financially devastating divorces. Gabriel, my mother interrupted my thoughts, you've been very quiet. I hope you're not judging our happiness. Our happiness. As if Richard had been part of the family for years, not a predator who had appeared in her life at her most vulnerable moment. I'm just processing everything, I replied honestly. It's a lot of information. It's simple, Richard said, his mask of patience beginning to slip slightly. You lend us the money for the wedding, we invest the return, and in 2 years you get back 3 times what you lent us. Everyone wins. Lend. Interesting choice of word. No contract had been mentioned, no guarantees offered. Just the word of a man who had gone bankrupt twice promising easy money. What if I need the money sooner? I asked. You won't, my mother replied quickly. You have your salary, your apartment is paid for, you have no family of your own to support. Why would you need $45,000? The question revealed more than she realized. They had really investigated my financial situation. They knew about my apartment, my expenses, probably even my savings account. Richard leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. Gabriel, I'm going to be frank with you. Your mother has been suffering from depression since your father died. This marriage, this new chance at happiness, may be exactly what she needs to heal completely. Depression. Now he was playing the mental health card, suggesting that I would be responsible for my mother's psychological well-being if I refused to pay for diamonds and a honeymoon. He's right, my mother whispered, her eyes filling with tears that seemed perfectly timed. Some days I can't even get out of bed. But when I'm with Richard, when I think about our future together, I feel alive again. The tears were genuine, which made it all the more disturbing. She truly believed that this man was her salvation, that $45,000 would buy lasting happiness. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing and simply didn't care about the consequences for me. I see, I said finally. Do you want an answer today? Well, Richard checked his fake Rolex. I had learned to recognize the knockoffs during my work with corporate fraud. The wedding planner needs the deposit by Friday to secure the dates. And the investment in Miami has a limited window. Of course it did. There was always urgency with con artists. Always a deadline that prevented the victim from thinking clearly or doing proper research. "All right," I replied, reaching for my wallet. "I'll arrange a wire transfer tomorrow morning." The relief that washed over them was almost palpable. Richard relaxed his shoulders, my mother stopped wringing her napkin, and they both began talking excitedly about flowers and bands and expensive photographers. As they planned my supposed financial ruin, I watched and memorized every detail. The way Richard checked his phone every few minutes, probably coordinating other schemes. How my mother avoided mentioning any specific details about the depression that supposedly afflicted her. How neither of them asked about my own life, my own plans, my own dreams. To them, I was simply a human ATM to be withdrawn from. What they didn't know was that I had recorded the entire conversation with a discreet app on my phone. That I had copies of Richard's financial records, including the 2 bankruptcies and the suspended license. That I had hired a private investigator the week before to document their every move. And that the wire transfer I would make tomorrow would be just the first move in a game far more complex than they could have imagined. As Richard paid the bill with a credit card that was probably maxed out, I smiled and said, "I'm glad you're happy." And I was. Because happiness based on stolen money is notoriously fragile. And I was about to prove just how fragile it could be. The next morning, I made the bank transfer of $45,000 to the account Richard had provided. The money left my savings account like blood from an open wound, but I needed them to feel secure, confident, invincible. 3 hours later, my mother called. "Gabriel, dear, you can't imagine how grateful we are." Her voice overflowed with a joy I hadn't heard in years. "Richard has already contacted the wedding planner and the photographer. Everything is being arranged." "That's great, Mom. I'm glad you're happy." "And about the investment," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Richard said that the sooner we invest, the greater the return. Do you have any more money available? Maybe another 20,000. Another 20,000. Their appetite was growing. "Let me check my finances," I replied calmly. "Maybe we can discuss it over Sunday dinner at your place." "Perfect. Richard will be delighted. He has some documents to show you, some financial projections that will really impress you." After we hung up, I sat in my office for several minutes, watching the city bustle below. Down there, normal people were living normal lives, unaware that their mothers were conspiring with professional con artists to steal their life savings. My phone rang again. It was Marcus, my partner at the law firm. "Gabriel, I just got a strange call," he said without preamble. "Someone asking about you, about your financial stability, if you have any vices, psychological problems. Said it was for a life insurance check." Life insurance. They were investigating whether I would be a good risk for larger loans, or if there was any way to declare me incompetent to make financial decisions. "What did you say?" "I told them they should talk to you directly or find another lawyer." "But Gabriel, this sounds familiar. Remember the Morrison case? Same tactic they used on the widow before draining her account." The Morrison case. A client of ours whose stepson had systematically isolated her from her family, questioned her mental competence, and finally obtained power of attorney to protect her before transferring all her assets to his own accounts. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me. Discreetly." "Sure. What do you need?" "I want you to hire Jake Sullivan to do a complete investigation of Richard Spencer. Financial history, court cases, previous relationships, everything." Jake Sullivan was the private investigator we used for complex cases. A former Chicago police detective, he specialized in financial fraud and white-collar crime. Suspecting something? Not suspecting. Knowing. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's house to pick up some documents she had mentioned, my father's life insurance papers that supposedly needed updating. It was a transparent excuse to visit her, but I wanted to see how she and Richard were behaving now that they had access to my money. The house was different. New furniture in the living room, a leather sofa that cost at least $8,000. A 75-inch television mounted on the wall. Expensive floral arrangements in every room. "Gabriel." Richard appeared from the kitchen, wearing a silk robe and leather slippers. At 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. What a wonderful surprise. "Are you home today?" "I took the afternoon off to celebrate our new venture," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the expensive purchases. Your mother's at the salon getting a facial. $250 treatment, but she deserves to be pampered. $250. In one day. With my money. Things going well at work? I asked. Better than ever. In fact, I just closed a big deal. A client in Miami, exactly the project I mentioned yesterday. The timing couldn't be more perfect. He led me into the kitchen, where he opened a bottle of champagne that cost more than my average lunch. To celebrate our family partnership, he said, pouring 2 glasses. Family partnership. As if stealing money from his stepson was a joint venture. Richard, about those investments. Do you have documentation? Contracts, feasibility studies? Of course. In fact, I brought some papers for you to look over. He pulled a folder from the kitchen counter. I know you're a lawyer, so you'll appreciate the attention to legal detail. The documents were impressive at first glance. Elegant letterhead, colorful graphics, financial projections that looked promising. But my legal training taught me to look beyond the pretty presentation. The building permits were dated for the previous year, but the documents showed construction starting next month. The names of the investors listed included people who, a quick Google search revealed, had been dead for years. And the company's Miami address corresponded to an empty parking lot. Impressive, I said, closing the folder. Can I take a copy for my accountant to review? Of course, of course. But Gabriel, his expression became more serious. We need to act quickly. The investment window closes on Friday. After that, the next investors on the list will have priority. There was always a rush. Always an artificial deadline to prevent careful analysis. I see. You said you've already invested your own money. Yes, $50,000 of my own capital. Everything I could scrape together. He laughed nervously. Linda thought I was being reckless, but sometimes you have to take risks to win big. $50,000 he didn't have, invested in a project that didn't exist, to convince others to hand over real money. When my mother arrived from the salon, her face was glowing from expensive treatments and expectations of easy wealth. She hugged me with the enthusiasm of someone who had found the solution to all future financial problems. Gabriel, dear, did you bring the checkbook? Richard said that the more we invest initially, the greater our share of the profits. Actually, Mom, I have some questions about the project first. Her smile faltered slightly. What kind of questions? Technical questions. As a lawyer, I need to fully understand any investment before recommending it to clients. Clients? Richard interrupted. Are you thinking of bringing in other investors? Possibly. If the return is as guaranteed as you say, it would be irresponsible not to share the opportunity. I saw Richard and my mother exchange another of those conspiratorial glances. More investors meant more money, but also more scrutiny, more questions, more risk of exposure. Well, Richard said carefully, this particular project has limited capacity. Perhaps we should keep it within the family for now. Sure. Keep it in the family. Where the victims were more trustworthy and less likely to ask tough questions. That night, I returned to my apartment with the absolute certainty that my mother had chosen a criminal over her own son. She wasn't being duped, she was actively collaborating in the scam. The pain of that realization was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Losing a father to cancer was devastating, but understandable. Losing a mother to greed was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. But as I processed this brutal reality, something else was taking shape in my mind. It wasn't blind anger or a desire for emotional revenge. It was something colder, more calculated, more surgical. It was justice. If they wanted to play games with money, I would play. But by my rules. And when I was done, they would understand exactly what the real cost was of trying to cheat someone who had dedicated his career to studying how criminals think, how con artists operate, and how the law punishes those who destroy families for easy profit. I picked up my phone and dialed Jake Sullivan. Jake, it's Gabriel. I need to speed up that investigation Marcus mentioned. And I need something else. I want all the details on Richard Spencer's previous relationships. Specifically, other widows he may have met in the last 5 years. Something tells me you're not just planning to protect yourself, Jake said. No, I replied, watching the city lights through my window. I'm planning to end his career permanently. Because when you attack the family of a financial crimes lawyer, you're not just committing a crime. You're making a mistake that will change your life forever. On Friday morning, Jake Sullivan showed up at my office with a folder thicker than a dictionary and an expression that mixed professional admiration with genuine disgust. Gabriel, in 20 years of investigating con artists, I've never seen such a systematic pattern, he said, spreading photographs and documents across my desk. Richard Spencer isn't just a criminal. He's a specialized predator. The evidence was devastating. 7 women widowed in the last 8 years. All between 50 and 65 years old. All with substantial life insurance policies. All left financially ruined after marriages lasting between 6 months and 2 years. This is Margaret Crawford, Jake pointed to a photo of an elegant gray-haired woman. Widowed in Portland, $75,000 in life insurance. Richard met her at a bereavement support group. They were married within 4 months, and he disappeared with all the money last December. Disappeared how? Faked his own death in a boating accident in the Bahamas. Less than 2 weeks later, he showed up with a new identity and started courting his next victim in Seattle. My mother wasn't the first. She was just the latest in a production line of emotional and financial devastation. And this, Jake continued, showing another photo, is Patricia Wong, a widow in Sacramento. Richard convinced her to invest $90,000 in a resort that never existed. When she finally went to the police, she discovered that the man she had married was technically dead and the marriage documents were fake. Fake marriage. Richard has at least 3 active identities that we've been able to track down. Professional quality forged documents, elaborate stories, even fake job references. This man isn't an amateur improvising. This is an organized criminal operation. I took my mother's photo out of my wallet and placed it next to the other victims. The pattern was obvious. Smart, independent women, grieving, all vulnerable at the exact moment when they needed to believe that love was still possible in their lives. But Gabriel, Jake leaned forward, there's something different this time. From the conversations I was able to record during surveillance, Richard is talking about a grand finale. Apparently, the wedding money is just the warm-up. What do you mean? They're planning to have you sign a power of attorney. Full access to your accounts, your apartment, your investments. Richard mentioned something about early retirement after this job. The coldness with which they talked about destroying my life was almost impressive. As if I were just a number on a profit sheet. There's more, Jake continued. Your mother isn't just a victim in this situation. She's actively collaborating. We found records of phone calls between her and 2 of Richard's former victims, supposedly to check his references. Only she never mentioned the previous marriages or the bankruptcies. My mother knew. At least partially. And she had chosen to go ahead anyway. What do you recommend? Legally? We have enough evidence for criminal charges in 3 states. But that would take years, and Richard would probably flee the country before the first trial. He has offshore accounts, alternate passports, the entire infrastructure to disappear. Jake paused, studying my expression. But you're a financial crimes attorney. I'm sure there are more creative methods of dealing with this. Creative. That was a polite way of suggesting that I use my knowledge of legal loopholes and corporate tactics to create more immediate and permanent consequences. I need 72 hours, I finally said. Continue surveillance, but keep it discreet. I need them to feel safe until I'm ready. That afternoon, my mother called again. Gabriel, dear, Richard has had a wonderful idea. Why don't we have dinner at home on Sunday? I'll make your favorite roast beef, and we can discuss some additional investment opportunities. Sure, Mom. I can't wait. And Gabriel? It might be a good idea to bring your financial documents. Richard would like to review your portfolio and suggest some optimizations. Financial documents. Professional jargon for getting me to sign papers that would transfer everything I own to them. Specific documents. Oh, you know, bank statements, investment information, maybe your apartment deed. Richard said there are some tax reforms that could benefit you substantially. Tax reforms that would benefit Richard Spencer substantially, more specifically. Perfect. I'll get everything in order. And I would. But not in the way they expected. After hanging up, I spent the next 4 hours creating what I secretly called Operation Mirror, using Richard's own methods against him, but with legal resources he never possessed. If you're following this journey of family manipulation and want to find out how a lawyer can use the legal system to create perfect poetic justice, be sure to subscribe to the channel because what happened on Sunday was the most satisfying masterclass I've ever given on consequences. Phase 1. I documented every financial transaction Richard had made with the wedding money. Jake discovered that he had used my transfer to pay off credit card debt under false identities. Federal crime number 1. Phase 2. I created a fictitious investment company with impeccable legal documentation and registered Richard as a partner without his knowledge. Legal trap number 2. Phase 3. I prepared fake power of attorney documents that would give him temporary access to bank accounts that I completely controlled but appeared to contain much more money than they actually did. Bait number 3. On Monday morning, Richard Spencer thought he was 72 hours away from retiring as a millionaire. In reality, he was 72 hours away from discovering that trying to cheat a financial crime expert was the most expensive mistake anyone could make. Because when you attack the family of someone who spends their days studying exactly how criminals think and operate, you're not just committing a crime. You're offering a masterclass on how justice really works when applied with surgical precision. Sunday arrived with cloudy skies and a sense of impending storm that perfectly matched my plans. I drove to my mother's house carrying a brown leather briefcase filled with carefully prepared documents, some real, some elaborately fake, all designed to create the perfect illusion. Richard opened the door before I even rang the bell, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His smile was predatory, like a shark that smells blood in the water. "Gabriel. What impeccable timing. Your mother is finishing the roast beef, and I just opened a bottle of wine to celebrate our new partnership." Partnership. The word tasted bitter. My mother appeared from the kitchen wearing a new dress I recognized from an expensive boutique downtown. More of my money turned into vanity while they planned to drain me completely. "Gabriel, dear." She hugged me with theatrical enthusiasm. "I'm so excited to discuss the opportunities Richard has lined up for you." The dining table was set with the fine china that had belonged to my grandmother. Ironic that they were using family heirlooms to celebrate the theft of the family. A bottle of French champagne rested in an ice bucket, along with crystal glasses reserved for special occasions. "Before we begin," Richard said, gesturing for me to sit down, "I must say that I'm impressed by your decision to trust us. It shows financial maturity to recognize when you need expert guidance." Expert guidance from a man who had gone bankrupt twice and robbed 7 widows. "Actually," I continued, opening my briefcase, "I brought some documents that may interest you. Bank statements, investment information, some things you mentioned." Richard's eyes lit up like Christmas lights. He leaned over the papers I had spread out on the table, studying numbers that showed impressive account balances, all meticulously forged, but convincing enough to feed his greed. "My God, Gabriel," he murmured, his voice heavy with feigned admiration. "You're much more financially successful than we imagined." "The law firm has been lucrative," I replied modestly. "And I've made some investments that have appreciated substantially." My mother approached, reading over Richard's shoulder. Her eyes widened when she saw the numbers. "Gabriel, dear, why didn't you ever mention these accounts? That's almost $2 million in liquid assets. $2 million that existed only on paper and in their greedy imaginations." "I've always preferred to keep things discreet," I replied. "But you're right. It's time to be more aggressive with investments. Richard, about that project in Miami." "Yes. Excellent timing." He pulled out his own briefcase, spreading out the fraudulent documents I had already reviewed. "As I mentioned, the investment window closes tomorrow. But with your resources, we can guarantee a much larger share of the profits." "How much do you recommend?" Richard and my mother exchanged a quick glance. I could almost hear the greedy calculations running through their minds. "Well," Richard said carefully, "considering your robust portfolio, something in the range of $500,000 would guarantee truly significant returns." $500,000. Their appetite had grown exponentially. "$500,000 is quite specific," I observed. "How did you arrive at that number?" "Market experience," Richard replied quickly. "It's the ideal entry point to maximize leverage without excessive exposure to risk." Pure financial jargon with no meaning, but delivered with the confidence of someone who had practiced these words on other vulnerable widows. "There is one thing," I continued, feigning hesitation. My accountant will want additional documentation before approving a transfer of this magnitude. Would you object if I brought in my investment lawyer to review the contracts? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard tried to keep smiling, but I saw muscles tense in his jaw. Of course, he said, his voice slightly strained. Although, considering the urgency of the investment window, perhaps we could proceed with a smaller amount initially. Let's say 200,000. Just to secure our position before other investors take our share. Always a rush. Always a reason to avoid careful analysis. 200,000 still requires documentation, I insisted. My lawyer is very thorough about compliance. It was then that I noticed the first crack in Richard's facade. His hands moved nervously, and he glanced at my mother with something close to panic. "Gabriel," my mother interjected, her voice taking on that manipulative tone I had known since childhood, "don't you trust my judgment? Richard has proven his expertise. These unnecessary legal checks will only delay our opportunity." "Actually, Mom, there's something I'd like to discuss about expertise." I picked up my phone and placed it on the table. I just received some interesting information about investments in Miami. Richard stiffened like a statue. "What kind of information?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Well, I called the Miami Urban Development Commission to verify the details of that hotel complex." Fascinating conversation. The silence that followed was thick as molasses. My mother looked between Richard and me with growing confusion, while Richard seemed to be rapidly calculating his escape options. "And?" my mother asked when the silence became unbearable. "I found out that the address Richard gave you is an abandoned parking lot. There's no approved development project, no building permit, no business registration." I kept my voice perfectly calm. "In fact, there's absolutely nothing in Miami related to the documents you showed me." The color drained from Richard's face like water from a bathtub with a hole in it. "There must be some misunderstanding," he muttered, but his voice lacked its previous confidence. "There must be," I agreed. "Especially considering that I also discovered that Richard Spencer, this Richard Spencer, has filed for bankruptcy twice in the last 10 years. And that his real estate license was suspended in Nevada for fraudulent practices." My mother turned to Richard with a look of growing horror. "Richard, what is he talking about?" But I wasn't finished. "There's more, Mom. Much more. For example, I discovered that Richard has an interesting pattern. Over the past 8 years, he has approached 7 different widows. All with substantial life insurance policies. All left financially ruined after marriages lasting between 6 months and 2 years. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "This is absurd. Gabriel, you're clearly confusing." "Margaret Crawford in Portland," I interrupted, pulling photographs from my briefcase. "Patricia Wong in Sacramento. Dorothy Sheffield in Phoenix." Shall I go on? The photographs spread across the table like cards from a macabre deck. 7 women smiling on wedding days that would become financial nightmares. My mother picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. "Who are these women?" "Richard's other wives. Or rather, his other victims." The revelation hit my mother like a physical blow. She sank into her chair, still clutching the photograph, her face running through a full range of emotions: shock, denial, gradual understanding, and finally, absolute horror. "Richard," she whispered, "is this true?" But Richard had moved beyond denial to a kind of desperate calculation. His eyes darted around the room, clearly looking for an exit. "Linda, you can't believe these accusations. Gabriel is obviously trying to sabotage our happiness out of jealousy or..." Jealousy. I laughed for the first time that afternoon. "Richard, you think I'm jealous of a career criminal who specializes in robbing vulnerable widows?" I picked up my phone again and showed the screen to both of them. "This recording is from our conversation on Friday, where you discussed how to get me to sign power of attorney documents. Pretty incriminating, considering that conspiracy to commit fraud is a federal crime." The final realization hit Richard like a freight train. His eyes widened as he realized that not only had he been found out, but that his every move had been documented, recorded, catalogued. "You," he said slowly, "you knew all along." "I knew from the first strange call to my office questioning my financial stability." "You weren't exactly subtle." I carefully gathered the fake documents. In fact, this whole charade over the last few days was to gather additional evidence. Evidence for what? My mother asked, her voice small and broken. For the FBI, for starters. Electronic fraud crosses state lines, especially when it involves multiple victims in multiple states. Also for the district attorneys in the 3 states where Richard left his other victims. And for the lawyers representing the families of at least 2 of the women he stole from. Richard staggered backward as if he'd been punched. You can't. There's not enough evidence. There's more than enough evidence, I replied calmly. Jake Sullivan, the private investigator I hired, has meticulously documented every aspect of her operations. Financial records, forged documents, even recordings of you planning how to manipulate me into signing powers of attorney. The color had completely drained from Richard's face. His hands were shaking visibly as he leaned on the table. What about my mother? I asked, turning to her. That's the saddest part of this whole situation. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes, but still trying to maintain some control. Gabriel, I didn't know about the other women. You have to believe me. Maybe you didn't know about all of them, Mom. But you knew about some. Jake found records of phone calls between you and 2 of Richard's former victims. You contacted them supposedly to check on his references. The last trace of color drained from his face. You knew at least part of his history and chose to go ahead anyway. Either because you thought you could control the situation, or because you decided that stealing your own son was worth the risk. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and Richard's heavy breathing as he seemed to struggle to process the magnitude of his situation. So, he finally said, what happens now? I smiled, not a smile of victory, but one of professional satisfaction from a lawyer who had built a perfect case. Now, Richard, you have 2 options. Option 1, I can hand over all the evidence I've gathered to the federal authorities this afternoon. Considering the number of victims and the total amount of money stolen, you're looking at between 15 and 20 years in federal prison. He swallowed hard. Option 2, you disappear. Forever. Leave the country, change your identity again, and never contact my mother or any member of my family. In exchange, I'll give you 48 hours before turning the evidence over to the authorities. What about the wedding money? He asked desperately. The $45,000 I transferred to your account? It's already been frozen by the FBI. It turns out that when you use fraudulently obtained money to pay off credit card debts under false names, you commit additional federal crimes. Richard's expression became completely blank. He finally understood that there was no way out, no manipulation or charm that would save him this time. 48 hours, he repeated mechanically. 48 hours, I confirmed. And Richard? If you try to contact my mother, if you try to come back, if you try any kind of retaliation, I will hand over the evidence immediately and make sure personally that you face every possible legal consequence. He nodded slowly, picked up his keys from the table, and headed for the door without another word. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a final shot. My mother and I sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the revelation hanging between us like toxic smoke. Gabriel, she finally whispered, can you forgive me? I looked at her, this woman who raised me, who taught me how to ride a bike, who stood by me at my father's funeral, and who then conspired to rob me with a career criminal. Mom, I said calmly, forgiveness isn't something you ask for when you're caught. It's something you build through genuine change over time. Tears began to stream down her face. What am I going to do now? It was a question she should have asked before deciding that my money was the solution to her problems. But as I looked at her, broken, ashamed, finally facing the consequences of her choices, I realized that the most complete revenge wasn't her destruction. It was her education. And that education was just beginning. Richard disappeared the next morning, taking only a suitcase with him. The FBI found his fake ID 2 days later, but he had vanished into thin air. 3 weeks later, my mother showed up at my door with red eyes and an envelope in her hand. Gabriel, I sold the jewelry Richard gave me and got back $22,000 of your $45,000, she said, her voice breaking. I know it's not all of it, but it's all I could get. I stared at the envelope without taking it. Mom, it's not about the money. I know. Tears streamed down her face. It's about trust. It's about family. It's about me choosing a stranger over my own son. 6 months later, Margaret Crawford, Patricia Wong, and 4 other victims of Richard sued him based on the evidence I provided. Jake told me he was arrested trying to pull the same scam on a widow in Canada. My mother started therapy. She sold the big house and moved into a smaller apartment. She got a job at a local store. Slowly, we are rebuilding our relationship, this time with clear boundaries and hard-won trust. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about revenge, but about self-preservation. Sometimes protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And when someone chooses money over family, you're not losing a loved one. You're losing an illusion. If this story of family manipulation resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who refuse to be victims and discovered that the best revenge is simply to live well. Today, I am a partner in my own firm specializing in financial crimes against the elderly. Richard taught me that predators will always exist. But he also taught me that with the right preparation, they can always be stopped.